That's the one right at yeah.
Yes. Great, you know.
Like, but I need to check that out. Yeah.
So you're just gonna golf.
Yeah.
Where I used to live, I was don't well over Georgia and up there and he's average. Leadership like German and North. I think it just started up like in 07. I mean, it's no more. Well, you probably did speaking of games together. I'll get back together. Yeah, like we're always talking about the Irish. Why don't we outdress? That's what you go on the piece of things. So, maybe a couple of times, yeah.
Anyway.
It was at least shorter. Yeah. I don't know what's working. Right.
It was like
this is still down.
Really, yeah.
How are you doing? Good call.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. Hello, thank you so much for coming out this brisk Tuesday evening. My name is Shady. I'm the events manager here at Lost City Books. Thank you all for being here. A few things before we begin. We are Lost City Books. If you've never been here before, I'll tell you a little bit about us. We are a new, used, and rare bookstore, and what that means is we spend a lot of time very carefully selecting the books that make their way onto our shelves. So when Vicki, where'd you go? When Vicki reached out about the scheme, it definitely appealed to the sensibilities of our store, and we thought it definitely belongs here with us. So we're so glad to have you, Jen. Before we begin, please silence your cell phones. Those things make a lot of noise, and we want to give Jen our utmost respect and attention. Nextly,
That would be awesome.
yes. Nextly, if you ordered your book online and haven't received it yet, just check in with me before you scurry away so I can get that to you. As you can see here, this event is being live streamed on both YouTube and Instagram. And while none of you are visible, if you choose to share a question or a comment, that question or comment will be a part of the live stream. On the subject of questions and comments, please hold them until the end of our discussion. You'll have some time we built in at the end to grill Jen as much as you like about this about the subject matter.
Put it right there.
So I mean, gently inquire. Gently inquire at the end of our discussion. Now I'd like to introduce Jennifer Mueller. Jennifer Mueller has worked as a judicial clerk, big firm litigator, policy consultant, law school professor, mediator, coach, writer, and once upon a time as an English teacher at the State Language School in Prague. Mueller represented the sponsors of BCRA in McConnell v. FEC as an associate of Wilmer Hale, and she has published several academic articles about political participation. Today, she works with clients in the public, private, and philanthropic sectors and coaches Public Voices Fellows with the Op-Ed Project. A native of New Jersey and longtime DC resident, she received her undergraduate degree from UNC Chapel Hill and her law degree from Harvard. Please welcome Jennifer Mueller. Changing hats. Jennifer, so happy to have you here with us tonight. And I'm really excited to delve into this big subject with you. But I want to start with just a few kind of broad questions about the book itself. When we're talking about the word scheme, it has so many connotations, not just about the conspirators of that scheme, but the scale of it. And we're talking about a really large scale scheme and a large number of conspirators. Can we talk a little bit about what is the scheme that is the subject of the book, and how did you first begin writing about it with Senator Whitehouse?
Thanks, Shady. So the scheme, which is, it's a potent word, right? But it's a very deliberately chosen word. There's a lot of back and forth actually about the word, because it is a very large plan that goes back decades. I'm not saying that there was a one room that was smoke filled on an island somewhere. I'm not saying that either. But there is a lot of evidence that starting in the early 70s, there was a very coordinated effort by a lot of corporate interests, billionaires, people who were disaffected by the government, who either, some people still had holdovers, arguably going back before the Civil War, who really didn't want to have a government by the people, who thought that a government by the people was actually really inconvenient to what they wanted to accomplish. And they were very upset that the people seemed to have so much voice, especially coming through the civil rights movement, the Warren Court years in the 60s. So a slow backlash began in the 70s and it involved, when I say part of the reason they say scheme, is it involved a lot of different parts. It involved parts that involved creating essentially a whole cloth new legal doctrines that were very much end oriented, result oriented, to try to get to the including things like gun control is a very obvious example to get to a result that somebody wanted. It involved a process of it involved actually a marketing campaign essentially, but from corporate America on TV. Fox News is an outshoot of this, but they're trying to present very well-spoken, nice-looking people that don't seem so threatening at all, with some really quite radical ideas. It involved a process for identifying, grooming candidates for the judicial bench and then getting them through. And to do all of this, obviously, it took a lot of money. There is, as of by the time we were going to press, there was at least, I think, 580 million that had been actually tracked just in the last few years. I mean, I would say it's been a multi-billion-dollar effort that goes back over 50 years. And since the book's come to press, obviously, we have the news of a $1.6 billion one-time one single donor, Barry Side, basically gave his company to a 501c4 run by the Federalist Society's erstwhile leader, Leonard Leo. That money, at least some of it, there's a good chance to think will eventually be used to get more judges onto the court. And the result of this, is we now have a Supreme Court, and this book really does focus on the Supreme Court. We have a Supreme Court now where 5 of its members were appointed by such a slim majority of senators that actually the senators voting against them actually represented more people in this country than the people who could put them on the bench. And 3 of those justices, and this has never happened in US history, much less 3 times in such short succession, 3 of those justices were also appointed by a president who did not win the majority vote. So we literally have an anti-democratic court that is engaging in increasingly unprincipled power grab in various sectors of American society. Or that's the argument we put forward. It is structured like an argument, so you can see whether what you think about it. We invite you to examine the evidence with us, and I will tell you that pulling that all together in the space of not a few months, but much less under a year. It was definitely done in under a year. It took just a tremendous amount of work by a lot of people. So. Sorry. Oh, the microphone. I haven't tried it.
Thank you.
Sorry. Does that help? Is it on?
Is that easier? Is that better? So sorry, guys. I wanted to allow you to finish your thought. But yes, so when we're talking about these major transactions, these huge amounts of money being sort of quietly moved into the right hands to position these parties or these organizations to essentially purchase the Supreme Court. You mentioned a little bit earlier that this isn't something that just started recently. It's a long legacy going back decades, if not maybe the entire history of the country. I don't know. But can you talk a little bit about that sort of lineage of events and actions and actors that led to this moment and led to the state that the Supreme Court is in right now?
So I can do that a bit, which is what we do in the book, but part of the point of the book is that so much of this has been done through dark money, through money that is untraceable and that has been deliberately sloshed around through different corporate entities so that the donor identity is scrubbed from it. And the Supreme Court has allowed things from anything from a super PAC to unlimited corporate independent expenditure has allowed this to happen. The Republicans in Congress have actually blocked the SEC from even engaging in a rulemaking to require public companies to report, to disclose to their shareholders who are providing the money, that to block the companies or to block the SEC from requiring the companies to reveal their political donations or their independent expenditures. So I can give you some broad strokes, but I can't really, but that's, in some ways, that's kind of the point, is that, I mean, how many people heard of Barry Tsai before he suddenly popped up with a $1.6 billion, I mean, a $400 million tax dodge for him, a $1.6 billion gift to the conservative cause, and that's a single transaction. So you have to start somewhere, and the place that we look is Lewis Powell. Before he became Justice Lewis Powell in the Supreme Court, Lewis Powell was an attorney based in Richmond, and he was asked by a friend and neighbor of his who worked for the Chamber of Commerce, which is not the Chamber of Commerce that we know today. I think it's to address what he saw as the attack on the free enterprise system. And he put together a memo. You can read it online and judge for yourself whether we quoted the best parts. But he put together a memo that is that, especially given what a measured person really Justice Powell turned out was, how measured, what a measured person he was in the court. It really is kind of he talks about battle, he talks about frontal attack, he talks about assault. He suggests that, and he says, this is the greatest corporate American businesses today is the greatest marketing juggernaut this world has ever known. We need to put it into business defending ourselves. Every corporation to commit at least 10% of its profits to actually marketing the American people on how great we are and how terrible these laws are, how terrible Ralph Nader is, how terrible. And we should send people out to universities. We should get people onto TV shows talking about this. And we should focus on the courts and try to drive change through the courts. And within, as I said, within the space of a year or two, the Business Roundtable, Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, Federalist Society was about it. That Federalist Society was about a decade later, but all of these began to roll in. When he wrote the memo, there were maybe 100 companies in this that had corporate lobbyists or that had a lobbying shop of any sort of government relations office in DC. By 1980, I think it was 2,500, and now it's just, billions and billions of dollars. There were a handful of federal lobbyists, and now it's out of control. As early as as late as the 80s, when the chairman of, I think it was the Armed Services Committee, was invited to go to a fundraising event where there would be members from defense contractors, and he said, well, that wouldn't be proper. I can't go and go to a party with these guys because I hold life and death over them. And obviously, if you can just, anyway, it seems quaint now.
Quaint is one word. Thank you. So when we're, earlier you mentioned that the scheme, this book is essentially an argument that yourself and Senator Whitehouse are assembling all of this information through what sounds like a great effort, because as you mentioned, a lot of what you're discussing is dark money. So can you talk a little bit about what the argument is of the book and how sort of shining the light on this dark money helps to further that argument?
Well, the argument is that the argument is that we should be worried, and that this is not something, it's gratifying to see so many people I know here. It's also gratifying to see so many people I don't know here, but just from the people I do know, I know not everyone here is a native Supreme Court speaker, shall we say. And I think that is the real argument, is that this is something, and this is why we tried to write it in as accessible a way as possible. The real argument is that we should be paying attention to this, and we should care, because this is really very important for a whole bunch of the things. A lot of the things that people are disaffected about now trace back to a lot of this. It's about who makes the rules and how the rules are made, and whether those rules are actually are fair. And if anyone out there thinks things have been smelling a little bit funny, that was for Senator Whitehouse. That was what motivated him to start looking into this. And by the time he dug up enough, nobody in his conference, is a story he tells in the book, nobody none of his fellow Democratic senators wanted to go after the Supreme Court, just because you don't go after this. Once you start questioning the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, it feels like there's an entire house of cards that can fall. But with the evidence that he turned up, and just also looking at the pattern of partisan decisions, the Roberts Court, I think, has the record for the number of precedents reversed by a 5-1 partisan split vote. I don't think it's, as he says in the book, there's not a Democratic senator in the Senate today who doesn't think there's something seriously structurally wrong.
Thank you. I know that you were thinking of reading a selection for us.
I was thinking, I have so many, you can see all these different flags here. I take requests, but I think what I'm going to read, I actually had. So one of the things we talk about in the book is this kind of, as I said before, this multi-stage process that there's a bunch of different working pieces. And one of those is just what we call it cooking up cover doctrines, or things that are very much reverse engineered and based kind of theories that you can kind of insert into, you talk about it on, you may talk about it maybe in some briefs, you might write a law review article about it, you get people talking about it on TV, and then you fund a dozen different organizations to all file separate amicus briefs to make it look like there's a whole bunch of people who support this one, like this idea, when there's actually just like 2 or 3 really deep-pocketed funders just trying to create a chorus. Anyway, so this is a little bit about that doctrine factory and some of the things that the right wing has cooked up. The scheme donors out to capture the court need legal theories that will deliver the right outcomes for them. It's best for them if these theories can be disguised so they can be deployed with some semblance of impartiality by friendly justices. This gives the moment intellectual cover and allows its adherents to shield themselves with theories or doctrines without confessing the extreme outcomes they seek or the special interests they serve. It's principle. To do this, the theories need to be fabricated, reverse engineered from the desired outcome, then they must be socialized and moved into the mainstream. This requires some kind of machinery, and a doctrine factory exists. The scheme's doctrine factory relies, like the scheme's other elements, on covert work, dark money, and many of the same front groups. The Federal Society helps cook up and socialize these doctrines, but it's not alone. There's the Koch-funded Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation, among others. Probably the worst of them all is an ideological hothouse just down the road from Washington, D.C. at George Mason University, a public university based in Fairfax, Virginia. Cooking up cover doctrines has a long history at George Mason. It is where the radical anti-government fringe found a home in the decades after a unanimous Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that the Jim Crow separate but equal standard violated the Constitution and that public schools would have to be integrated. Objectors didn't argue, keep Black kids out of our white kids' schools. They argued states' rights. Giving public vouchers to white students to attend segregated private schools, schools that could avoid Brown's desegregation mandate, made it a school choice movement, not a pro-segregation movement. And just to jump ahead slightly, of all the cover doctrines, the most offensive ones twist the constitutionally enshrined concepts of liberty and freedom to protect power grabbing, pollution, and cheating.
The freedom to bust unions is not real freedom, not to union members. It's a power shift between employer and employee. The freedom to pollute for free is not freedom to those who suffer from the pollution. It's a power shift to polluting interests. The freedom for banks or for fraudsters' boiler rooms to cheat customers is not freedom. It's a power shift from consumers to the bottom dwellers who commit fraud in the financial services sector. These fake freedoms damage the real freedom that comes with being able to live in safety, peace, and prosperity. When there's hypocrisy in the daylight, look for power in the shadows. There's a lot of hypocrisy around cover doctrines. States' rights was an important cover doctrine to protect Jim Crow, but where was it when Heller and its progeny overturned local gun safety laws, utilizing an interpretation of the Second Amendment that Chief Justice Warren Burger, a Republican appointee, called, quote, one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public. The biggest canard of them all is originalism, the legal theory that launched the Federalist Society and the conservative right-wing legal movement. Originalism started as the notion that courts had strayed from the original text and meaning of the Constitution and should return to a mythical original interpretation. But originally, voting was limited to people who were white, male, and owned property. Originally, Black slaves were quantified as 3/5 of a person. Originally, women had virtually no economic role or property rights. Originally, Black and whites could not marry, gays could be prosecuted and imprisoned. And originally, an agrarian society needed little consumer protection. Without massive industries, it needed no protection from abuse by massive industries. For an arch conservative, you can see the charm of originalism, but most normal people don't think that what everyone needs is a bit more 1788 in their lives.
Thank you. So I am really interested in the concept of the cover doctrine. So if we could delve a little bit more into that, I'd like to hear what you think. If you give me a second to collect my thoughts, I'm still lost in what you just read. But what we talked about a little bit when we were video chatting was the popping up of new sort of factions of right-wing parties. So we talked about the Tea Party coming in under this great moral wave of what you just discussed, the covered doctrines for their true aims. Can you talk a little bit about some of the other right-wing organizations in present day now that are using this tactic and how that has sort of damaged the democratic process as a whole?
But I think dark money damages the democratic process as a whole, just because if you don't know who's speaking, it's really hard to judge the messenger. If you see an ad on TV, you kind of want to know, and it's telling you that you should oppose something that's happening, maybe oppose a new factory, say down the road. You kind of want to know if it's coming from Exxon or if it's coming from Sierra Club, right? We care who the speaker is. We evaluate things, and when we can't evaluate things, or when you have a bunch of front groups like Moms for Education, which I think is actually an actual one, puppies and apple pie for Washington, D.C. I mean, who doesn't? And you begin to just everybody, it sounds so good, and you want to nod along. One of the things that a lot of this book, I will say, is trying to assemble the work of just so many researchers and so many different people trying to put it together to create a narrative. And one of the things that those researchers have discovered is that, and I think everybody is familiar at this point with the fact that tobacco companies knew for a long time that tobacco was a health risk and caused cancer, and that for a long time they engaged in deceptive marketing and denied the research and what have you. And eventually in the late 90s, there were a whole bunch of lawsuits, and they were found to have committed massive fraud. One of many of the ways that that they fought initially the FDA wanting to regulate cigarettes is they created a bunch of front groups that said that were good science groups and were supposedly neutral messengers. saying, no, this is, and they would get on the news and say, this isn't right. And of course, it turns out that a lot of these organizations were entirely created and funded by the tobacco industry. Right around the time that tobacco lawsuits were happening is when a lot of the concern about climate, this is about 25 years ago, was really beginning to heat up. A number of the exact same organizations just pivoted and became climate denial organizations. And there's a lot of evidence that the fossil fuel industry, which is both deep pocketed and has a very vested interest in not just in essentially gumming up the works. It gets huge subsidies right now from the federal government, and it can see the way that the wind is blowing, that if you actually, that any new legislation is probably not going to favor it. But many of these same organizations ended up in the same, very much the same tactics with, which a lot of it actually mimics the two things that we talk about are covert actions overseas, which that a lot of this looks very similar to the type of covert action, something you would see as a covert action overseas, where the idea is to drive change, but not necessarily let anybody see who's pulling the strings. And the truth doesn't really matter. The whole idea is to create dissension and to create confusion. For example, does climate change really exist? And the other is we have seen for decades regulatory, what we call regulatory capture, which is the idea that an industry maybe gets a little too close and cozy with the regulators that are regulating it, and all of a sudden the agency isn't really doing its job anymore. We saw that with the financial crash. We've seen that with some of the BP explosion. Anyway, so these are both of the people involved in these elements. We see the same elements coming over to agency capture and also to court capture.
So it sounds like what we're talking about is very old money being secretly shepherded in the shadows and creating corporations whose entire job is to push the narrative of certain actors behind that money. So can you tell me a little bit about, I had a much more eloquent way to put this if I was listening to you, but can you tell me a little bit about the, for the average person maybe watching the news or thinking about politics, thinking about the Supreme Court and the decisions that are being made. If I were to go on the internet, for example, and say, I think the government is controlled by a few elite corporations and this, that, and the other, people would kind of laugh me off the internet. But the fact of the matter is that there's an incredible and obvious truth to that. And I wonder if you can explain a few of the tools that you use in writing this book. And you mentioned a lot of researchers that came together as well. Some of the tools that you use to illuminate this in a way that is clear and undeniable, so to speak.
So why is this not just a crazy crackpot theory? There's a scheme. So there's a lot of at this point, there's a lot of hard data. We present 80 cases. It's actually closer to 90 cases that were decided by a 5-4 majority before Amy Coney Barrett joined the court. Where the decisions almost unanimous all fell into one of 4 buckets, either cases undoing voter protections, going after elections, civil rights, protecting corporate interest, or feeding a right-wing base. And it's an extraordinary, where the 5 conservative justices lined up on that side. We can see just the Chamber of Commerce, that, anti-government Chamber of Commerce is actually I think you have to combine the next 2 or 3 lobbying shops to actually match the Chamber of Commerce lobbying expenditure. And it is also one of the biggest, if not the biggest litigator, most frequent litigator in the Supreme Court. If you go back and just look at let's take the Chamber of Commerce. In the mid 80s in the Burger Court, the Chamber won about 47% of its cases before the court. In the mid-90s to 2005, when Chief Justice Roberts became the Chief Justice on the Rehnquist Court, it ticked up a little bit. I think they won about 56% of their cases. They now win over 70%. Justice Gorsuch, I think, votes with them over 80% of the time. As of 2019, I think this may have changed since, but in 2019, an organization looked at the chamber decisions, and they found that the court had reversed a few decisions that hadn't favored the chamber below for the chamber above, but and cases that came up that favored the chamber, they hadn't. I don't think they reversed a single one and for 4 years, which is, and that's significant. If you look at what happened, there's a lot of data about what happened under Trump in terms of judicial confirmations. If you just do a comparison of what it looked like under Bush, under Obama, and then under Trump, like you will see that there was very much not business as usual. 5% of Obama's judicial nominees were under 45. Nearly half of Trump's were. No, Trump didn't nominate a single Black person to the appeals courts, and was very. Anyway, let's just say his numbers were a little off in most of those regards. 10 of his nominees were actually rated unqualified by the ABA. 7 of them are judges federal judges with a lifetime appointment today, including for the first time in our history, somebody who was unanimously rated unqualified, and somebody who is now on one of the appeals courts who is rated unqualified. So I think that there is a lot of some of it is conjecture, some of it is what we would call circumstantial evidence. It's still evidence. We invite you to make, but there are a lot of hard numbers that are really pretty damning.
So for the average American voter, I can't quote the statistic right now, but especially recently, the average American voter that I know, at least, is deeply unsatisfied with the way things have gone with the Supreme Court, especially this past couple of years. And as you're indicating with this book and everything that you've said today, there are so many large forces that are not driven by the will of the people that are driving these decisions and driving these appointments. Something that we talked about on the phone yesterday was the Supreme Court appointments that were done essentially extrajudiciously. And so my question for you is, does the scheme get into any solutions for the average voter to think about how to resist the forces of right-wing dark money that have suffused our democratic systems? And if not solutions, are there leanings, are there ideas that are coming out here as well?
Okay, that's a lot. Let me break it down. So this is not a solution-oriented book, which is going to be frustrating, and it was something that we discussed. But this was not designed to be an extended op-ed saying, and therefore we need to do this. That the point of this book is to get people paying attention, to make people aware that this is happening. And that is, there's a few different reasons. One is, as Senator Whitehouse said to me, as soon as I put something out there, I'll have a target on it. And he has some experience with that because he's been trying to get his Disclose Act, which would address some of the dark money concerns which all Democratic senators are on record supporting. They have voted for. It has been filibustered and blocked. So he knows that this would happen. But the other thing is that this really should be a bipartisan effort. This should be, if we can get agreement that these are things that we all should care about, there should be ways to come together on this. So this is really about pointing out some of the real problems. And there are things that deeply, and you were absolutely right, Shady, I think last year, I think that the people were asked, I think the confidence in the Supreme Court was something like 25%, which is, and the entire, this is that they don't have a budget, they don't have much by way of a budget, they don't have an army. Their entire legitimacy relies on people thinking that they are worth respecting. And if they are just tossing that away with a naked power grab, that is a dangerous situation. But on the subject of solutions, there's several things that come to mind. And I should say right now, these are what I am suggesting. I am not speaking for Senator Whitehouse, so I think you might co-sign a few of these. First of all, is to enforce our existing laws. The 501c4, the actual code says that these are that 501c4s are social welfare organizations. The actual law says that these are organizations that should operate exclusively for public welfare. Then there is a regulation that goes back to, I think, the 1950s that said exclusively for the public welfare means, among other things, you can't have a primary political purpose. And what that has become to me, especially after the faux IRS scandal from a few years ago, when the IRS actually tried to enforce those provisions, is that as long as you don't spend more than 49.999% of your funds on politics, you just give the other 50% to another organization, which then uses 50%, and sort of in a cascading kind of Russian doll kind of situation. The IRS we can enforce that. We can get the SEC to require corporations to disclose political spending. We could fix a broken FEC, which gets complaints all the time about people violating campaign finance laws and other laws that they can't, but they're not fixing. So there are existing laws. I mean, we can look at campaign disclosure forms and forms that organizations submit to the IRS, and when we see discrepancies, you can refer those to the DOJ. So there are things that can be done in terms of what can be done about the Supreme Court. And I do think that and the Supreme Court seems to be, in some ways, despite our book, which I'm not sure if they've read it or not, but they seem to be accelerating in terms of power grab. And I'm thinking this in part because a friend and former colleague of mine has recently started a Substack. He actually has a book coming out, I think, later this year, Steve Vladek. The Substack is called One First. The book is about the shadow docket, but I was reading it recently, and there is the Supreme Court technically can hear any appeal from any court, but as a matter of judicial restraint, it usually waits for a case to go through a trial, and then an appellate court or the circuit courts, and then it will eventually come to it, and then it decides whether it's going to take it. And it usually only does that if there's a conflict between the circuits or if it's a really important constitutional question. But the Supreme Court is allowed to just jump over the appellate review and just grab a case and take it if it wants to. But that's considered that's a real violation of the way things are supposed to go. And the reason I bring all this background up is I learned earlier this week that from 1988, when the laws were sort of changed to allow this, up to, I think it was 2004, the court did this sort of hopscotch over the appellate process 4 times, and all of those were kind of emergency cases where they really needed to have some kind of final word right away. From 2004 to 2019, didn't do it at all. And then from 2019 to today, I think it's done it 19 times, including the Title 42 case, which is the question of whether we can continue to exclude immigrants on the southern border on the basis of the pandemic restrictions. So anyway, that's a long way of saying the Supreme Court doesn't really seem particularly cowed or concerned that people are losing faith in it. If anything, it seems to be a little even more power grabby. There are different things that can be done. People have talked about term limits. One idea that I like is not necessarily kicking somebody off the Supreme Court, but requiring them to take senior status. And then because one of the other problems which we discuss in the book is the fact that one of the reasons justices don't recuse themselves when they have at least there's an appearance that they could be potentially compromised. One of the reasons justices don't recuse themselves is because that would deprive the court of their vote, because then they wouldn't have a full 9 justices. In a lower court, if a judge on a 3-judge panel steps aside, somebody else takes their place. So if you have a roster of emeritus judges or justices or senior justices, there would be somebody available to take that justice's place. You could look into figuring out a way. It used to be that the number of justices has changed often on the court, and it used to track the number of circuits. Today we have 13 circuit courts. You can figure out a way, and obviously nobody's going to want to hand somebody 4 new justices, but you could maybe you put in 1 new justice on each of the next 4 years or something like that, to allow to sort of slow roll it and allow maybe there's the possibility that a president from a different party might appoint them. There are one thing that's very much low hanging fruit is we need ethics rules. We need disclosure of gifts. They should not be allowed to be members. If you want to speak at any organization, you want to speak at an organization, but the fact that they're still members of both the American Constitutional Society and the Federalist Society and other, apparently or potentially partisan groups or groups that push particular legal worldviews. These are all problematic things, and the fact that the court continues to resist it is not a good look. I feel like I was a really long answer. Sorry, guys.
That was great. So essentially what you're saying, the answer is pay more attention, hold the Supreme Court accountable, and uproot these dark money influences wherever possible through the long game.
But I said it with so many more words.
For people like me who needed a summary, that was for me. So we have just enough time for some questions from our audience before we close up for the evening. Let's see.
Yeah.
So for centuries, there's been an idea that the court's legitimacy is foundational, it's necessary. If the public were to lose the respect of the court, things would fall apart. And Chief Justice Roberts continues to pay lip service to that idea anyway. I'm curious whether the findings of your book are consistent with that view, or whether they call that view into question, that the court's legitimacy ultimately doesn't matter. What matters is the court's power, which maybe is less tethered to legitimacy than we thought.
I think we're in scary times as the court loses its legitimacy, because it's one of those things you kind of don't want to know. The one thing that I actually think we can take part in, and I do not, the very first conversation that Senator Whitehouse and I had about doing this book together, I actually said to him, I was like, does it feel vaguely irresponsible to be telling everybody this? Because again, we're just adding on and keeping on to this, adding to the idea that the court is illegitimate, it's all cooked, and will that just hasten the decline of democracy? And he said something along the lines to me of, if the emperor, he's like, I worry about that too, but if the emperor's not wearing any clothes, we're going to get the emperor to put some clothes on. I mean, at the end of the day. And one of the things that actually gives me, and I would not want anybody to walk away from the book thinking that every judge or justice has a political agenda. And one of the things that I take part in is so much of the federal bench that is actually not in the Supreme Court. And this isn't every judge, but they're really, they have a judicial code of ethics. They understand that this isn't a good look for them. They don't like the fact that the Supreme Court can get away with dodging some of these disclosures. And in fact, in the last days of the Trump presidency, Mitch McConnell reportedly reached out to a lot of sitting federal judges, trying to encourage them to retire so that Trump could appoint their replacements. And it appears that a number of judges held out just to wait out Trump, because all of a sudden there were a ton of federal vacancies. And as soon as Biden came to office, we quote in the book 2 judges, one a current sitting judge, one a former judge, who've both made very public statements. So I do think that there to take some heart that some of like the judiciary itself is in some ways trying to fight back. How it can do that and maintain the omerta that that shields the court is going to be it's going to be interesting watching for those of you who are interested in these things.
So, and there's two groups, categories of interest. One would be political, where it's to end abortion or to deal with moral issues, religious issues. And the other would be primarily economic, to have favorable regulations for various industries. And within that group, I suppose there would be conflicts, like a group that wants to do more releasing of waste in the water system would affect another economic group that wants clean water. How does it play out with those sort of conflicting economic interests?
Usually it's the major corporation and the big donor that wins over the people who are affected, say, for example, downstream by the water. One of the best ways, a good example, I don't know if it's the best way, is to look at what the Roberts Court has done with arbitration, which is a private system. It's actually funded typically by the corporation. It's secret. We now have a number of years of studies showing that consumers, employees, the people who are being shunted into mandatory arbitration do much, much worse in arbitration in terms of the percentage who win and the amount that is won even by those who win. And it has just been and it also, I will just add, speaking of originalism and textualism and some of these other canards, not canards, I don't want to say that some of these other things that the right holds up as their guiding principles. A right to a jury trial in civil cases, that's actually in the Constitution. So but there have been more than I want to say more than a half a dozen cases that have whittled away arbitration rights for shunted more people into arbitration, made it harder to do a class action arbitration, expanded the kinds of things that can be arbitrated, allowed corporations to force people to give up their statutory rights in arbitration, and all of those. That would be an example for
And between corporations?
Sorry?
Between corporations.
So arbitration was designed to be inter-corporation, and when it's two major corporations arbitrating, it works great. It works reasonably well. A lot of these things are not about what's happening in between the corporations. It is really about preserving corporate power against the employee, against the consumer, against the resident in the polluted neighborhood. You don't have a clash of the titans, so to speak, really, that these guys are deciding. It's all kind of worked out, and then it goes up to the Supreme Court. Yeah.
I have to admit, this was a really hard book. The Supreme Court is a revered institution. I want to believe that lifetime appointments are there to provide independence and kind of a separation from the temptation of that revolving door that we see in regulatory bodies and corporates, for example. And I suppose while the book isn't solution oriented, we can't help but go there. It screams transparency and sunlight and these kinds of solutions. But I guess the question I'm grappling with is if we think about ways to limit the long-term effects of this kind of influence in the Supreme Court, it leads us not to trust in the moral independence and adherence to originalism, or the opposite of originalism is, but rather determinants and think actions of Congress that will limit the liberty, limit the independence of a court. Is there anything better out there? I suppose is my question. Is it term limits and transparency? Is that where your head is as well?
Certainly transparency. I think Norm Ornstein, we cite a lot of Republican and right leaning people, in the book. Again, we want to make this is not a Democratic or a left wing project. It's a much bigger issue than that. Norm Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute, which is right, I believe has also called for term limits. There have been a number of, I think that there actually has been may have been a bill introduced for term limits. I think that it is I don't have a problem. I would rather see them cycle off the court and maybe become a judge in a lower court with the ability, because I do think the lack of recusal, the fact that there's a lot of times when there's arguably, I think everybody could think of some cases maybe from the last year, or maybe around January 6th, that there's some of the justices maybe had at least an appearance of being somehow compromised, and maybe they should have recused themselves. And I think that if we can take that argument away, well, then there won't be a full 9. No, there is. If we can call, well, yeah. But this person down the road will come right over. Yeah. Yeah.
So let me, I haven't finished, so there may be evidence of these things that I be interested in hearing about, but let me start with the parts that I completely think it's great to eliminate, like the fact that the chamber is winning all these cases, the arbitration stuff. I think that the court has incredibly radical in one way, but I think that is not brought. I mean, we talk about abortion cases in the press. We don't talk about all these business cases. We know about all these business cases, and I think these results exactly the way you're talking about. When I just gently ask about 2 things. One is, it doesn't. I'm not convinced that the justices think they are making up these documents. All of us probably look at a legal case and are partly influenced by the result we want. And so I don't know that it's anything other than they've convinced themselves, and is one thing. And secondly, I do think all the evidence you muster of this long-term plan is clearly right and convincing. But I wonder how much of it is really money worry. I mean, it's okay, the right decided in the early 70s, partly maybe the Powell memo, partly the Roe and so forth, were it's really important to us, and public, because of abortion, people care about that. So it's really important to us. And there's all these institutional, all the things we know about 2 senators per state and all those things give the right more influence than they should if you were looking at it. But that's different than sort of money, like the dark money part of it, and how much of that. I'm not sure they needed, I guess, some dark money or all these moneyed interests to get where they want. They just made that their project for whatever we are, or maybe I'm wrong, but I guess how much evidence is there of the connection between money and the fact that there's all these donations and where we are, or how we are?
Do you mean what do we know about money being a motivator, or
yeah, or having caused I could see, even if everybody was spending equally and it was all transparent, that we could have ended up in exactly the same place, given the right was really motivated to get there, and they had this power because of the Senate. And
so I am actually going to answer that part by actually referring you to Nancy McLean's book, Democracy in Chains, which is actually a really interesting exploration of the transition from, as at first, if you think about it, and we talk about this, I mean, you had the Goldwater campaign, you had David Cox, he ran on the Libertarian ticket. You had initially some very, I mean, the right, or I don't want to say, it's not, I mean, at the time that David Koch ran the Libertarian candidate, the mainstream Republican Party thought that they were crazy right wing. I can't remember what they didn't call them crazy right wing nut jobs, but it was anarchists. And they had there was a great name. And it was a very deliberate strategy to go dark, essentially, to I think the Koch brothers said, you only shoot a whale and you surfaces. And so to the extent your question is whether you could have done, it would have been the same transparent. I don't actually think so, because I think it had to be it was a concerted effort to separate, to go after, say, little pieces of the pie, and also to hide the end goal, because when they tried to do it openly and publicly, they didn't get enough votes. I mean, they got no support from the public, or very little support from the public. So I think that it was a deliberate decision to go underground, so to speak. And then your first question was, remind me your first question?
Oh, just whether, whether the justices, I think they believe what they're doing. I mean, not whether, yeah.
So I think that is part of indoctrination. Like, I mean, you just defined what indoctrination is, right? And grooming and it's great to be the cool kid. And one of the things we talk about is like these justices, they are treated like rock stars when they go and show up at these Federalist Society events. And they push back hard when the judicial conference suggested that now we're going to have a rule saying judges, you can't belong to one of these organizations. The conservative judges push back hard, which to me, so I think you're right. I think that sometimes so two things. One is, I think you're right. I think that there's a level of unawareness, but to me, that two things that follow on from it is, like, as a judge, you should be aware of the potential for bias, or looking out for the potential for, like, this is the way bias happens in some ways. And you should be aware that maybe you shouldn't be speaking at these events, or going on these junkets, or, going to, skeet shooting with the, people that you're, or taking Air Force 2 with the vice president when he's a named party in front of you, that maybe you should be aware, like, I think that they begin to think of themselves as being right because they're a justice instead of justice because they're right. I think I got that right. And then the other thing is just that and I don't know how far you've gotten, but we have a rebuttal section of the chapter we called so-called conservative principles, where we just say, okay, well, let's look at all the times where it would have been really awkward if you had actually applied this principle, because it would have come out not for the side that you wanted. And I think that there's also a lot of places where, they abandon textual. I mean, most notably in the EPA case, the major questions doctrine is a lot of ways a huge sidestep around textualism, like, oh, we know that's what the law says, but is that real? I mean, there's a whole bunch of ways that so yes, but I would just say, A, they should be more self-aware, and B, they should be a little more consistent. Right there and over there then.
Started telling a little bit of story about working at the White House. I wanted to just a little bit more to how the collaboration came out and any other little nuggets.
I will tell you my favorite Sheldon Whitehouse anecdote from this project. So I had no experience. I had never worked on the Hill. I had never met Senator Whitehouse. I had seen the Amy Coney Barrett hearing, which maybe many, or at least some of you may have seen. And I was approached and asked if I'd be interested in working on this project. I have a background in campaign finance. So one of the reasons that Citizens United sits so unhappily with me, which makes me maybe uniquely amongst, or even more so than many of the average American, is on the case that had overturned McConnell v. FEC. I was actually one of the main junior associates on the case, and I was in charge of putting together that record. And I know how hard we worked on that record and how much the court relied on the record. And so for the case that overturned it to just have no record whatsoever, because we don't need facts, because we were pretty sure that this is the way the world works, was just unbelievably irksome. that's, and then I've also worked in other areas. So it was flattering to be asked. I almost immediately said absolutely not. And then was persuaded to reconsider. And then we actually worked, I think, overall quite well together. There's a lot of material to get on top of quickly. We agreed pretty quickly on the approach for the book. But my favorite Sheldon Whitehouse anecdote is that he only edits by hand. And I would just, he's like, where can I FedEx this to you? Or how do I get this to you? And we're supposed to be turning the document right before the holiday, right before Christmas of 2021. We were supposed to be turning a draft over to people to help work on the footnotes, which is a whole nother story. But he, for some, the FedEx was delayed. So I was suddenly getting it, the entire, at that point, it was like imprinted, it was like a 300, it was a word or page manuscript with his handwritten notes. And I would have one day, because I was leaving I got it Thursday morning. I was leaving on Saturday or Friday morning for the holidays. I would have one day to enter all this. And I was like, Sheldon, I don't think I can do this. I said, I really don't. I'm going to have limited time at home with my family. I really don't want this to eat into the holidays. And he said, gotcha. Okay. I'm going to be on a long train trip. I'm going to start from the back. You start from the front. We'll meet in the middle. And the two of us just basically entered his hand edits for the whole day. He sent me his part portion by like 7 o'clock that night. And by 9:30, it was actually out the door. And everybody had nerves. And then I saw a question over here.
Yeah, so this book is about sort of the Republican dark money apparatus. But there's also dark money groups that are aligned with Democrats. Within the Senate, One Nation is the top dark money spender, shares offices with the Republican Senate Leadership Fund, their staff. But there's also Majority Ford, which is kind of aligned with the Senate Democratic leadership. And taking nothing away from Senator Whitehouse, he's introduced the Disclose Act frequently since like 2012, if I recall correctly. And you mentioned earlier that all the Democrats went on record sort of in September voicing support for it. But we've also seen a bunch of Democrats in the House recently introduce constitutional amendments to overturn Citizens United, introducing acts to require dark money or the IRS to pressure dark money groups to disclose over $5,000. All of these bills don't have the votes. They're mostly symbolic gestures. And during the 2020 election cycle, Democrats actually benefited more from dark money than Republicans did. All of this to say is
right? Yes, but that to the extent you know where, yes.
At least according to Open Secrets, which is where I work. I'm very lucky to get to report on campaign finance. And
I love your website.
When I talk to people, though, a lot of the times what I hear is, they are doing it as well. We need to have the funds and resources to combat this. But as elections get more and more expensive, as dark money is being disclosed less and less, I was wondering if you could speak sort of to that argument and political will to actually do anything to give Congress more authority to regulate campaign finance, and whether it's a good idea to also let the kids guard the candy store, as to say.
And the amazing, so to the kids guarding the candy store, one of the reasons the McCain-Feingold bill was so amazing is because it was worked out over the course of many years by the exact people who were like, no, but if but if you do this, no, I see how this is going, right? So it was people who actually had some political experience, and then it was struck down by a whole bunch of people who had really no political or electoral experience. And so that was, I think, I think Senator Whitehouse and I both think it was in some ways the political naivete of the Supreme Court, like the theory, like they were operating in such a world of theory as opposed to political fact. One of the anecdotes that Senator Whitehouse actually shares in the book is that he was a few years ago, and I don't know if you've read the book, but he was talking to a Republican colleague, and they were both talking about how terrible dark money is. And Senator Whitehouse says, so will you sponsor a bill with me on this? You want to get on my Disclose Act? And the guy said, we have a 10-to-1 advantage in dark money right now. Why in the world if you want us to come to the table on dark money, you guys need to start raising a lot more dark money. And that is in fact what happened. And so in theory, you may have like some kind of, like, this might be what you need to get to a, some kind of arms agreement, but I am not sure that as long as you have this Supreme Court, I'm not sure that will be the case. But and you're right, it's bad on both sides, not knowing who the speaker is. I mean, the one thing, I think the analogy that Senator Whitehouse has used is it's like you're playing a game of touch football and all of a sudden the other side shows up with baseball bats on the field. You kind of need to get your baseball bats too, but the whole idea is like at least your side is trying to get back to a game of touch football. Then I don't know if that's a good enough analogy, but you are right. But I'm sorry to say that unless this Supreme Court making the constitutional calls, it will take a lot. Especially, I mean, it will take a lot.
One more.
Such a naive question I have. For a while, there was a discussion about raising the number of people on the Supreme Court, but some of these problems you're talking about are so structural. Would more people, especially being appointed by this administration, help? Why or why not?
I think that there's certainly an argument for adding more people, and maybe you don't have a full nine. Maybe you keep it 9 here a case, but you have 13. There's 13 circuits right now. And one way you can do it, as I said, is you could add a justice every 4 years for the next 16 years, which would allow there to be a intervening presidential election and maybe give people a chance. Does anybody remember that West Wing episode where they're like, I know, we're just going to pick the best liberal and the best conservative and put them on the court together and they will ride off and be Scalia and Ginsburg or something. But I think that there are ways to do it, but it will involve political compromise and will involve vested interest. And I think that the question then becomes the Supreme Court is a third branch of government. And so at what point will it see something done by Congress as invading its prerogative? One thing, we know just historically, Congress has changed the number. So there's a historical basis, at least for that, as opposed to term limits and some of the other ideas.
Wonderful. Thank you. This is a stirring conversation, and I think we all have a lot to think about. Now we can mingle and chat and enjoy the rest of our evening. Thank you all for being here. And
Thank you
so
guys
much
for coming. I will turn off the mic.